G'day guys, in this video series I'm going to be talking to you about the World Team Championships of Warhammer 40k from the perspective of the captain of and World Leaders player for Team Australia. We're going to dig into the preparation for the event, how that all went down and what our team strategy was. We're going to dig into the War Masters singles event, we're going to talk about my list in detail, and we're also going to break down every round, every game that we played into every other opponent from nations all around the world. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the World Team Championships and Team Australia, this video series is for you. Let's get into it.
Look for the blood god.
Alrighty, welcome to this part 2 in my WTC series. In this video, we're going to be talking about the list that I took to the War Masters and the World Team Championships, an absolutely esoteric World Leaders list that's unlike anything you will have ever seen before. We're going to break down what went into the list, what it was, how we arrived at those conclusions, all of the thought and strategy behind it, and then in the future videos in this series, we're going to talk about each matchup and how the list actually performed. So in this video, we're going to talk about all of the process that went into developing this list, because it's quite a journey. So with that being said, let's get stuck straight into this video, eh? Alrighty, so I guess the best place to start is to just overview the list and talk about what was included, and then we'll break down in detail each element and how we arrived at it, and some previous versions of the list as well. So you've got here the WTC. This is all on BCP if you want to access it, if you want to copy paste it or anything like that. I'll chuck a link in the description below. But basically we've got, I called it the Red Butchers, or also known as the 30nators. So you'll see why it's called 30nators in a moment. So our Warlord was Khan the Betrayer, obviously no enhancements or anything like that because he's a named character. In the battle line, we had 3 units of Jackals, all equipped with a Dishonored with a Skull Smasher, an Icon, and a Mauler Chainblade. So 3 standard units of Jackals. Note that there's no spawn in this list. I took multiple Jackals instead, and we'll explain why in a moment. Then we've also got a unit of 10 Khorne Berserkers with your obligatory 2 Eviscerators, 2 Plasma Pistols, that sort of stuff. So 1 big unit of 10. And then another unit of 5, which served a very, very important purpose in the list as well. So we got the 10, which would have Khan attached, and then another unit of 5. We then have a dedicated transport, Chaos Rhino, with a combi weapon, combi bolter, Havoc launcher, and that would be where Khan would obviously go. Typically, not always, but typically. And then we had, in our other data sheets, we had 2 units of 3 8-bound with the Lacerators. So these are your regular 8-bound, not exalted. And then to round out the list, we have 3 big units of 10 World Leaders Terminators. The loadout for these guys we went with was essentially 6 guys that would have a Power Fist and a combi weapon, 2 guys that would have Chain Fists and Reaper autocannons, and 2 guys that would have dual accursed weapons. So that's the list. So you can see why we call it the 30nators or the Red Butchers list, and it's all because the list is themed around those Terminators. Now, Terminators, you'll know, are one of those units that nobody takes, nobody rates them, and everybody just takes maximum 8-bound instead. So what I want to do is I want to talk about the journey that led us to 30 Terminators, because it's actually kind of interesting. So at the Australian New Zealand Team Championships, we were looking at the World Leaders lineup and how it paired in the Matrix, right? How in the team versus team lineup, it's very different than singles, right? So we were looking at what does the World Leaders have a strong matchup into and what does it struggle into, because we can generally avoid the things that it struggles into, so that's not that big of a deal. So we were looking at the things it has strong matchups into, the things it struggles into, and how it would likely go in the pairings exercise. Now, World Leaders really, really like a good table pick, right? They like to be able to hide their units. They like to be able to avoid shooting lanes and things like that. They like to be able to hold objectives from behind walls. And as a result, World Leaders were often going to be slated as an early put-up that people were going to be able to attack into, and then we pick the favorable matchup from those, right? So with that in mind, we were looking at it and we're like, okay, well, it's more important that we focus on what is likely to beat the World Leaders than what the World Leaders beat. Because nobody's going to pair things into the World Leaders that the World Leaders easily beat. They're going to pair things into us that they think beat the World Leaders. So let's have a look at those factions and then see if there's anything that we can do within the list to make those a favorable matchup for the World Eaters. Because there's nothing better than when you put up the World Eaters, they put in something that they think is going to beat it, and then you beat them. That's way more powerful for a team lineup than if they put up something, you put in something you think is going to beat it, and then you beat it. It's like, yeah, but that was a predicted win. Getting those wins when your opponent thinks they're going to win, but you win, is absolutely fantastic in a team's environment. So we were like, if we put up World Eaters, what are they going to attack it with? What do they think beats it? And what can we do to beat them, right? And at the time, Death Guard was quite prevalent, and we were like, Death Guard is something that they will attack the World Eaters with, because they got Plague Marines that have fights first, so that's really hard for things like Berserkers and 8-bound to get through. And then they also have brutal Overwatch, right? Anti-infantry 2+, really powerful Overwatch. So we're like, that is a real hard matchup for the World Eaters, especially when they've got indirect shooting as well, and things like Mortarion, really, really powerful elements that they can play. So we're like, how could we make the World Eaters list stronger into Death Guard? Because if we can flip that matchup, then every time we put up the World Eaters, they pair in Death Guard and Tau, or whatever it is that they also think beats the World Eaters, and then we can pick the Death Guard and actually win the game. That's how we're going to win this matchup. So we're sitting there and we're looking at it, and we're rolling out the maths, and we're like, if there's 10 Plague Marines on an objective, I can't really shoot them, which is one of the weaknesses of Death Guard, right? Because you can just shoot them, and you do fights first, and Overwatch doesn't really matter. But World Eaters can't do that. So I'm like, I can't shoot them. We could pivot the list into having things like Forge Fiends, or Lord of Skulls, or things like that. But Lord of Skulls is a problem on these tables, because there's so much terrain. And then the Forge Fiends, they are not effective, right? Like, if you're going to take Forge Fiends, you don't take World Eaters, you just take a different faction. So we're like, nah, Forge Fiends are not it, and the Lord of Skulls is not it. What else could we do? Because if 6 8-bound charge those Plague Marines, in Overwatch they're going to kill 1 or 2, then they're going to fight first, and they're going to kill 1 or 2. So now you've lost 3 or 4 8-bound, and if you've lost 3 or 4 8-bound, the 2 or 3 8-bound that you have left aren't going to be bringing enough damage to kill all those Plague Marines. And as a result, you're just going to lose that fight. Even though you're going to kill a bunch, but you're not going to kill them off of the objective. They're going to continue to hold it. And then in the retaliation, they're going to be able to fall back with that unit and then hit you with something else. Or they're just going to fight first with that unit in their turn and kill the rest of your 8-bound. So it's like 8-bound can't dislodge Plague Marines from objectives. So we're like, that's a problem. So that's when I was like, well, hang on. What if instead of 6 Exalted 8-bound, it was 10 Terminators? Now, because they're anti-infantry with high AP, it's going to be roughly the same damage coming in, but you've got 10 bodies instead of 6. So now those Terminators can come in, Overwatch kills, 2 or 3, then, or, 1 or 2 or whatever, then you charge them, they fight first, they kill another 1 or 2, right? So now you've lost, let's say you've lost the same 3 or 4 Terminators instead of the 3 or 4 8-bound, but that means you now have 7 Terminators left. And those Terminators are now getting a +1 to hit because they've taken casualties, which means those Terminators are going to blow up that Plague Marine unit, take the objective off them, and you're still going to have 7 Terminators left that they're going to have to deal with. And if you're able to do that on, on an objective whilst you've got Anger ongoing and bullying another objective, Berserkers coming out and doing their things, you can actually beat the Death Guard. That was the idea. So we put the Terminators in. We had so essentially we had a traditional World Eaters list with Angron, some 8-bound, Berserkers in a Rhino, all the stuff you know and love. But we swapped out the 6 Exalted 8-bound and we put in Terminators. And then we had 3 units of 3 Exalted 8-bound, and they were sort of scrapping pieces. But basically the big anvils were Angron and 10 Terminators. And then we went to the ANZ and I didn't get paired into a single Death Guard matchup. Even though we were predicting that if we put me up, they would pair in the Death Guard, we either played against teams that didn't have Death Guard, or when we played into them, they must have either seen it coming, or, whatever. Either way, they didn't pair their Death Guard in. Maybe they were holding their Death Guard in order to counter one of the other combat armies in our lineup, or maybe that, whatever was going on in their heads. Either way, we didn't end up versing any of the Death Guard, right? So this Terminator unit that we'd specifically teched to try to flip a Death Guard matchup, that never actually happened. Then we play into the event, and the most powerful unit in my army in every round was the Terminators. They were fantastic. I played against Sisters of Battle twice, which is another one of those matchups that can traditionally be kind of tricky for the World Eaters, because at the time they had fights on death, they had that stratagem that forces you to fight a specific unit, things like that. And one of the things I found was that the 10 Terminators with those 6 combi weapons and the 2 autocannons, that actually puts a ridiculous amount of shooting downrange. So I was able to drop and just shoot Repentia dead. Whereas previously, Repentia were a massive problem for the World Eaters, because if you charge them, they fight on death and kill you, and if they charge you, they kill you. So either way, every time you engage with those Repentia, you lose. Whereas in this situation, I was able to drop Terminators, shoot the Repentia, and then charge 10 Terminators into the Arco-Flagellants, and those 10 Terminators with all of those high strength, 2 damage weapons, were actually killing through Arco-Flagellants. So I was like, okay, so against the Sisters of Battle, the Terminators were really good. Played against Chaos Knights, and the Terminators were insane, because because they got the 4-up invulnerable saves, the 2 melter gun shots from the Brigand kills maybe 1, and then the 12 chain gun shots doesn't even really kill a Terminator, because you got 2-up saves. If you're in cover, it's very hard for them to dislodge you. So it's like, it actually takes like 5 Brigands and like 2 Carnivores charging to kill that 10-man Terminator unit. It's so tough, because there's so many bodies, and the 2-up saves with the 4-up invulnerable saves, just really, really hard for those weapons to chew through. So we're like, okay, they were the most powerful unit in the Chaos Knights matchup. They were the most powerful units in the Sisters matchup. We know that they were going to be strong into the Death Guard matchup. We basically put it into a bunch of different stuff, and every single time, the Terminators were the best performing unit. So we're like, after the event, and I didn't perform particularly well in that event. I lost a few games, some of them quite disastrously. So we basically, when we got back, we did like a post-event analysis, and we're like, the only thing in that list that was good consistently was the Terminators. So then we're like, what if you took 2? What if you took 2 units of Terminators and still had Angron and this, that, and whatever, but remove some of the MSU pieces and take 2 units of Terminators? So we did that. We had a bunch of practice games, and with the other members of Team Australia got around and we played it, and we're like, holy crap, these Terminators are amazing, because now you can have one deployed in your deployment zone, you can rapid ingress the other one. And now, if anybody comes anywhere near the middle of the objective, you can hit them with 10 Terminators from your deployment zone. And then if they don't, and they try to fan back and try to hide from you, you can, in your second or third turn, rapid ingress those that second unit and go in and hit them. So like, this is fantastic. So we were playing with those, getting really good results. One of the things that we found was that Angron was becoming a bit of a liability in the list, because part of what we're doing here is we're designing the list to pick a certain table, and that way we can hide everything and keep everything safe. But all of the tables that we wanted that would hide all the Terminators were containing all these ruins that were really slowing Angron down, because he has to go up and over or all the way around the ruins, which really slows him down. So we're like, okay, well, we took Angron out and we put Khan in a Rhino full of Berserkers in, which is roughly the same points. It's actually a little bit cheaper, and that could sit right up at the front of a ruin, and then Khan can just disembark and run straight through the walls. So that makes Khan and those Berserkers is way faster than Angron. Even though Angron has that whole 22-inch move then charge, because he has to go around things, he's actually quite slow. And he's also quite vulnerable to being shot by things. There's all kinds of challenges with Angron. Whereas Khan and the Rhino, cheaper, and projects a bigger threat. And then also the Blood Surge move is something that can absolutely win games. If your opponent misplays and they kill some Berserkers, and then you Blood Surge move into them and tag everything, and then, yeah, it can be an absolute blowout. So we had 2 units of Terminators, Khan in a Rhino, and then a ton of 8-bound was the list. And then the more we played it, the more we realized that the Terminators were just massively overperforming from what you would expect, even into things like Blood Angels. Like, we had a game where we're playing Blood Angels, that matchup, which is something that's really interesting, because combat on combat. But one of the massive advantages of the Terminators is that if you have enough CP, if you play conservatively in the first couple of turns, build up your command points, you can send out 2 units of Terminators. When they charge you with their faster Blood Angels, because they're faster than your Terminators, you can go, cool, the first unit of theirs that fights, you turn on -1 damage, and they don't kill you. And then you spend 2 command points to interrupt and fight the other one. And as a result, you win that combat, and then you win this combat. So we're like, wow, 2 units of Terminators is a real problem for Blood Angels if I have the command points. So then we started looking at the list and like, well, how can we ensure that I have the command points, right? World Eaters have no way of generating additional command points. So what we needed to do was we needed to design the list so that it could play a slower game. Instead of sending 8-bound out and trying to escalate the pace of the game and spending command points in the first couple of turns to make sure you're doing damage, we thought, what if we design the list so that it does nothing in the first 2 turns, and then in the last 3 turns, it goes out fully powered up, right? So that's when we're like, well, what if we put in a 3rd unit of Terminators and removing some of the 8-bound and Lord Invocatus and that sort of stuff, because we don't want to engage in the early part of the game, because then that incentivizes us to spend our CP on things like rerolling a charge if we fail it, or plus the auto advance 6, or those sorts of things. And we're like, we don't want to be spending command points early. So we took the aggressive elements of the list out, replaced it with more Terminators, and then we spent all of the rest of our points on Jackals. Now, the reason that we didn't bring any spawn and instead brought Jackals is several fold. One is that even though the spawn probably have a slightly higher damage ceiling, like they put out more damage, none of it is meaningful damage, right? Like, you're not going to send 2 spawn into a unit of, Vanguard veterans and do anything worthy of note, right? And same goes for Jackals. So both of them, their damage output is below a certain threshold where they effectively do no damage, right? They're not in the list to do damage, right? They could kill a couple scouts, that's about it, but we found that the Jackals would kill probably just as many scouts as Spawn would kill, or just as many, guardsmen or other, trash tier sort of screening units. So, like, the damage output is irrelevant. The Spawn are more durable, significantly more durable, because they have the feel no pain and the lots of wounds and all the things that make Spawn fantastic. However, what we figured out was that if we've got 30 Terminators hidden, right? Maybe you've got 2 units in Deep Strike and 1 deployed, or 2 deployed hidden and 1 in Deep Strike. Either way, if they're all inaccessible to your opponent, and you put out a unit of Spawn, your opponent's just going to turn their entire army on that unit of Spawn and just kill it. They're much tougher than Jackals, but they're not tough enough to break through that threshold to survive. So whether or not you put Jackals on an objective or Spawn on an objective, your opponent is going to kill them, right? So now we go, okay, well, their damage output is higher, but that's not particularly relevant. Their durability is higher, but that's not particularly relevant. The one thing that the Jackals have that the Spawn don't have is sticky objectives, which is really, really important for this list, because we don't want to have to be spending command points to sticky those objectives. We want Jackals to just move out and just do it, right? And also, they have a larger footprint. So because you're going to have very few units in the army, you've got Terminators, you've got a Berserker Rhino, and then the rest of us is in Deep Strike, you can't screen out your opponent. Your opponent's going to come in and they're going to get you if they want to come in and get you. So we're like, we need bodies. We need lots of bodies. So we want to be able to go, cool, there's 1 unit on the backfield and they're stringing out, creating that sort of umbrella shape to make sure your opponent can't Deep Strike behind you. And then there's 2 units up in front that are able to push out onto objectives and screen out your opponent's drops and move block your opponent and prevent them from getting into the Terminators too early, because like we said, we wanted to slow the game down so that we'd have a lot of command points for our go turn. And then, so that's why we went with the Jackals over the Spawn. And it was a decision that I was very, very happy with, because those Jackals were killing things when they needed to kill things, small things, trading pieces, and they were surviving relatively well, and importantly, their footprint was big enough that I was able to screen out whilst holding objectives. Like, there might be an objective over here. I could go, cool, I'm going to put 2 or 3 Jackals on the objective, so I hold that now, and the rest of the unit's going to screen out, so you can't drop in this corner now. Whereas if that was just 2 Spawn on the objective, your opponent would just drop in behind the Spawn and go in for your Terminators. So having those big units of Jackals was really, really powerful. And then the last element for the list was the unit of 5 Khorne Berserkers. And the reason we did this was originally a unit of Jackals as well. We originally had 4, but we had a few floating points that we couldn't figure out how to spend, so we upgraded one of them to a unit of Berserkers. And we ummed and ahed about this because we were like, well, now we're losing footprint, because now we don't have a big unit of 10 Jackals, we have a unit of 5 Berserkers. And also we're losing another sticky piece that can sticky an objective, because one of the things you can do is you can throw like 2 units of Jackals onto an objective, and if your opponent kills one but not the other, in your command phase, cool, you've stickied that objective now. Whereas if you just put 1 unit of Jackals on each objective, your opponent just goes cool and kills all of the Jackals, and now you haven't stickied anything. So we wanted lots of Jackals. But we basically traded one in for Berserkers, and what that did that was really, really good is it gave us a slightly elevated threat that we could use for early trades. So, for example, you got if you've got a ruin sort of up towards the front of your deployment zone, you can put your Berserkers in behind there, and if your opponent puts something like a Sentinel out onto a central objective, those 5 Berserkers could actually just jump out and kill it, right? Or if it's like a Neuralictor or something like that, or something that's too tough for Jackals to kill, but Berserkers could kill it, Votan Berserks was a good one. Like, put 5 Votan Berserks out, I'm going to charge them with my Khorne Berserkers. Yeah, I'm going to kill you, you're going to kill me, but now that objective is cleared. Whereas if you throw Jackals out, you're not going to kill them, and they are going to kill you. So having something that was a little bit tougher, hit a little bit harder, was fast, that was really good. An argument could have been made that unit of Khorne Berserkers could have just been 2 spawn, fill a similar role, but the Berserkers did it much better. And also, having that cheeky blood surge, you'd be surprised, even on a unit of 5, how often that would swing games and win, matchups. So that was the list, essentially. So you got Khan, 10 Berserkers in a Rhino, then you've got 3 units of 10 Jackals, 1 additional unit of 5 Berserkers, then the 2 units of regular 8-bound, I've got to talk about those, 2 units of regular 8-bound, and then your 30 Terminators. Now, the 2 units of regular 8-bound, they were in the list because there's a few things that we wanted to leverage here on the psychological front, right? So people, when they go up against World Eaters, they have a tendency to deploy super conservatively because they know that the World Eaters can charge them turn 1. They can scout 6, then move 6. Scout 6, then move 9, potentially 11 with the Blessings roll. Then they can auto-advance 6, and then they can charge. So they're really, really fast, right? Especially if you got like Lord Invocatus, Exalted 8-bound, all that sort of stuff. And as a result, your opponent deploys really, really conservatively. And we were worried that if we took out Lord Invocatus and took out all of the scouting 8-bound, our opponent was going to be like, oh, I can just deploy on the line because you can't charge me turn 1. And then they would be able to get their entire army into really commanding positions. So what we did is we put in 2 regular units of 8-bound because they have scout inbuilt. So they don't require Lord Invocatus. And now those 2 units, I would always deploy them right on the line first. That would be the first drop I'd do. And that way your opponent is going to go, okay, they now know where your 8-bound are. And they would deploy everything outside of your 8-bound's charge range. Every single game. And then basically in my first turn or during that scout phase, I would just scout them back into a ruin somewhere where they can't be seen. And now my opponent has deployed in a way where they're protecting from an attack that I was never planning to use. They've deployed really conservatively. And now I have those 2 units of 8-bound, which are my trading pieces into things that are too big for Jackals or Berserkers to deal with. And then the way that the gameplay would work was I'd have everything hidden. Generally it would be 1 or 2 units of Terminators deployed behind a ruin. Rhino with Khan deployed behind a ruin. And then the 8-bound deployed so that they could scout behind ruins, because I would always select tables and I would pick heavy tables where I could. And then that would be my deployment with Jackals just dotted around. And then pretty much no matter what happened, I would use the minimal commitment that I could in the first 2 turns to achieve my objective. So like if I turn 1 draw, area denial, right? I'm just going to send out 1 unit of Jackals into the middle and keep everything else hidden. And then being like, yep, cool, I scored my 1 card, your turn. Then they would obviously come in, they'd kill the Jackals off the center. If they shot them off, I could sticky it so that they wouldn't do that, so they'd have to charge something on. Now they've got something of theirs on that central objective. And in my next turn, I might just send the Berserkers out to respond to that. You know, because everything of mine is hidden, they sort of have to come around. They can't really shoot any of my valuable pieces, so they kill the jackals that I put out in the first turn, and then I just respond with my berserkers and I keep everything hidden. And now my opponent realizes they're going into their turn 2, they haven't killed any Terminators yet, which means they're going to have turns 3, 4, and 5, and they have to kill 30 Terminators. Pretty wild. And then basically what would happen is then they would kill what I'd send the Berserkers out, kill their off the central objective. They would then send some things out to kill me, and then on my third turn, that's when I would press the go button, and I'd go, cool, rapid ingress Terminators, in their previous movement phase. Then a deep strike Terminators. Those ones at deep strike, they would shoot some stuff and then go for a charge. These ones at rapid ingress would move out, they'd shoot some stuff, go for a charge. The ones in my deployment zone would come out, they'd go for a charge. Khan's unit would disembark, he would go for a charge. The 8-bound would come out and they would go for charges, and I would just hit them everywhere at once. Do massive damage in that turn. Even if I fail a few of those charges, it doesn't matter because you've got so many things going in. And then your opponent would go, okay, now it's their turn 3, and they've just lost a few big pieces. Now they need to kill 30 Terminators and 10 Berserkers and 2 units of 8-bound. It's so much to get them. And then as a result, they've often lost any of their big pieces that are able to kill 10 Berserkers in one volley. So now Khan's unit is Blood Surge moving into things all over the place. And at this point, I've spent almost no command points. So if they try to charge me on multiple fronts, I can interrupt, I can put the neg1 damage on, I can sticky objectives because by this stage I've got 3 or 4 CP to play with. Really, really powerful strategy. And we played a bunch of games into various lists, and we did really, really well. Even into things like Grey Knights that are historically a very difficult thing for world leaders because they can teleport away and do all this sort of stuff. When you just go, no, I've got 30 Terminators, they go, I can't chew through that in a single turn, and then you're charging them the next turn, and then you've got, the Berserkers do really good work in that matchup. Like, there was just so many things that were really, really powerful in that, even into the matchups that we were worried about. So that's essentially the story of the origins of the 30nators. It was developed here in Victoria by me, and primarily by me and Jeremy Martino. He would come over Tuesday and we'd workshop different list ideas, and that was over a 6-month period that we developed this list. Earlier versions of the list, instead of Khan and the Berserkers and the Rhino, would have Angron. That was really good in that it dialed up the damage of things like the Jackals and the Terminators, so that on the turn when the Terminators charge, before they've lost any casualties, they're only hitting on 3s, whereas Angron giving them the rerolls made them really scary. And Angron also himself is an absolute beat stick. He has fly, so he can't be blocked as easily, and he has the high AP, so things like Armor of Contempt aren't that big of a problem for him. And of course, he also has the capacity to be resurrected, which is absolutely brutal for your, those matchups. So we had a few versions that had Angron, and they were doing really, really well as well. In retrospect, I might actually go back to the Angron version, but one of the challenges that we experienced with him, which I alluded to earlier, was that he was really struggling to get over the terrain. Your opponent, a real savvy opponent, could go, okay, cool, I'm going to measure. You've got to go up over the terrain like this, which means it reduces your movement by that, which means you can fit somewhere around here. So they would just put models exactly where I could fit, and as a result, I had to go even further back. I couldn't land there because their models were there, which meant that he just felt really slowed down by that sort of the movement, the fact that he couldn't go through walls, and the fact that I was designing my list to pick the heavy tables that have lots of big walls. So he felt like at odds with the rest of the list in that regard, but he did do some really interesting stuff by dialing up the damage, and the fact that he had fly unlocks interesting stuff as well. So that was some of the earlier versions. We also had some of the earlier versions that instead of regular 8-bound, they were exalted 8-bound, and instead of Khan, it was Lord Invocatus. So we'd have like Lord Invocatus and Angron as the two characters, and instead of Khan and the Berserkers, you'd have Exalted 8-bound, because the Exalted 8-bound, they do hit significantly harder than the regular 8-bound, and they also do have increased durability with the 5-up Feel No Pain. So we did have some versions that had that. However, Lord Invocatus himself, I feel like he was often just too expensive, and he also incentivized a more aggressive playstyle, which is what we wanted to avoid. The amount of times where you'd be like, well, hang on, because of the way my opponent's deployed, I could scout move up Invocatus, scout move up the 2 8-bound, go in, turn 1 charge, and I might be able to kill a Dread Knight in the first turn, right? So you're like, well, killing one of the 6 Dread Knights in the first turn is a really, attractive proposition, because Dread Knights are really hard to kill. So if you can go, well, he's deployed 2 of them, if I move up, he can mist away with one of them, but he can't mist away with both, and if he mists, he's not able to use Armor of Contempt, so, or, true silver armor or whatever, so you're really tempted by it. And as a result, you then end up throwing away 140 point Invocatus and 250 odd point units of 8-bound, and you end up being, down. Like, that's not a good trade. So we quickly realized that was a problem. You were wasting those elements. And if your plan was to not use them in that way, and just use the scout moves, like I said, with the 8-bound, and use it to threaten the Alpha Strike, but then scout move back to safety, well, that works really well with the 8-bound. It doesn't work really well for Lord Invocatus, though, because he can't go through walls. So what I do with the 8-bound is I deploy them in front of a wall, and then with the scout move, I'd use that to move behind the wall where they're safe and they can't be shot. It's really hard to do that with Lord Invocatus because of the size of his base and the fact that he can't move through walls. It means that basically, if he's deploying up front somewhere, he's going to be shot turn 1. And you can't just have a 140 point unit that's going to just die in the first turn regardless of whether you go first or second, because you can't scout him to safety, so he's just going to die. So with all of that considered, we took Invocatus out, we took Angron out, we put in regular 8-bound, there was no exalted 8-bound in the list, and that's essentially the idea behind the 13-ators list. And like I said, in the upcoming videos, we'll go through in great detail each matchup that we played and how the Terminators performed, and then we'll also talk a little bit about the singles events as well, and what went well and what didn't, and what changes we would make. The only change that I will allude to now is that I'm considering going back to having Angron instead of Khan, primarily because fly keyword turns out is very, very important when almost all of your damage is coming from combat. So we'll get into that when we talk about the later rounds, but for now, that's the 13-ators list and the origin story and the ideas and philosophy behind the unit selection. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you're enjoying this series of videos on the World Team Championships. If you are, make sure to check out teamoz40k.com. That's the website for Team Australia. We've got a lot of really cool information on there. And also, make sure to like, subscribe, all that good shit. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.
Look for the Blood God.